Gary is the Reinhold Niebuhr Professor of Social Ethics at Union Theological Seminary. And rather than spend a lot of time, Gary, I hope you'll forgive me, I'm not going to talk about who you are, but I'm going to let you talk about who you are and let people go to the program booklet. And don't worry too much about the time. Say what's on your heart, and then we'll have generous question and answer up till 6.
All right. Thank you, Rodney. It's a great honor for me to speak on this occasion. I'm not, in fact, going to talk about myself or my work at all here. I did commit myself to a title and a subject for today. So if we want to get into how did you get into all this kind of thing, we can do maybe a little bit of that later. We're meeting this year, of course, as a virtual event in a time of crisis. The crisis that drove us online exploded into our lives in early March. It ripped through our communities with just devastating force, leaving a global trail of death and destruction. COVID-19 has stripped bare the injustices of our society, where Black and brown Americans have suffered the most, as usual. Every major city in the USA is a tinderbox of racial grievance and despair, trapped in America's legacy of racism extending to its founding. Now we are confronted with yet another Black man brutalized to death, as though his life did not matter. The murder of George Floyd is another reminder that there is no vaccine on the way for anti-Black racism. We grieve for him and the many Black victims who preceded Mr. Floyd in very similar manner. Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Laquan McDonald, Sandra Bland, Dominique Clayton, Botham Jean, Tatiana Jefferson, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, so many others. We are bombarded with crises piled on each other and compounding each other. We've lived through crises that seemed world-shaking for a while and then passed. The Cold War, 9/11, the financial crash of 2008. Anti-Black racism and economic justice are crises of another kind. Both of them are such fundamental and long-standing features of our society that it can seem paradoxical even to refer to them as crises. Today, I'm going to linger over the crises of anti-Black racism and economic injustice that founded social gospel movements on both sides of the color line. The social gospel was very much a Christian movement, and I'm speaking out of that, but also one reason that we honor the social gospel was precisely because it founded the ecumenical movement that then finally later sort of gives birth to forms of ecumenical ministry and practice that are in fact interfaith, as this organization so magnificently represents. But a crisis is a crisis partly because it defies certainty, confident speaking, assurance, thinking that you know the answer. In 1910, W.B. Du Bois founded Crisis magazine as the flagship of the newly founded NAACP. He had no idea if it had any chance of succeeding. He quit his job at Atlanta University and dragged his family to New York with no guarantee of a salary. Du Bois had just failed crushingly in his previous venture, the Niagara Movement. Before that, the Afro-American Council had failed, and before that, the Afro-American League had failed. Founding the NAACP and its magazine were desperation moves for Du Bois. After World War I, when theologians began to hold conferences again, they repudiated the language of cultural progress that they learned in graduate school. Western civilization and modern thought were in crisis, they said. The first name of the dialectical theology movement that formed around Karl Barth was crisis theology. It was a reaction to the slaughter and destruction of World War I and the imperial hubris that produced it. Modern theology had sanctified the conceits of bourgeois culture. Crisis theology was about shattered illusions, the experience of emptiness before a hidden God, and what Barth called the unexpected surge of spiritual meaning that he found in the strange new world within the Bible. A new world enters our world by the grace of God's Spirit. Barth said that before the kingdom of God can become real to modern people, there must come a crisis that denies all human thought. Actually, you cannot write systematic theology on that basis. And Karl Barth spent the next 12 years figuring out how to be a theologian. Crisis theology, he came to realize, was too infatuated with its own rhetoric of crisis and too eager to theologize it. But the saving truth in the rhetoric of crisis is that our knowledge is fallible, situated, and fragmented. We have no control over that which we need: grace and love divine. I do not know how to frame the multi-layered crisis of our time. This past February, I finished a big book on the history of American democratic socialism and sent it off to my publisher. For those of you who don't know, yes, I have about 21 books out there, so this was just the next one. But this one felt quite precarious to meet a publishing deadline, just as Bernie Sanders seized the lead in the race for the Democratic nomination for president. I took consolation that there would be room for editorial tweaks, at least, just before the book went to press. Then the world changed with stunning, sweeping brutality. Italy was devastated. And in New York City, we wondered fearfully, will we be ravaged like Italy? Soon, New York was worse than Italy. COVID-19 overwhelmed New York hospitals and piled up bodies in makeshift morgues. It surged north, south, and west across the nation, worse than any other nation, exposing that the mighty USA was less prepared than any comparable society to handle the onslaught. The federal government did the minimum while President Trump sprayed his news conferences with a fire hose of lies and self-congratulation. State governors shut down their economies to flatten the curve of infection and save local hospitals from crashing. Black and brown Americans suffered the worst, while healthcare workers struggled heroically to save as many lives as possible. Then the governors began to reopen their economies before 98% of the US population had been tested even once. In April alone, the US economy lost 21 million jobs, a doubly disastrous figure for a nation that ties healthcare coverage to a job. Back in February, Sanders surged in the Democratic race while Joe Biden stumbled through the early primaries with a wan message about restoring political normalcy. 5 major candidates clogged the moderate lane, all of them warning that Sanders was too left-wing to defeat Trump. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Warren tried to find a lane between the 5 moderates and Sanders, and in Boston, you saw how that turned out. The field consolidated with breathtaking speed, narrowing to Biden versus Sanders, just as contagion fear swept the nation. Today, Biden is pondering in his basement whether he dares to move left, as Franklin Roosevelt did in 1933. Meanwhile, Trump knows very well what works for him. The same divide and conquer racism and nationalism that put him in the White House. And so we are in for a very intense summer. In the USA, we have long debated 2 contrasting visions of what kind of country we want to be. The first is the vision of a society that provides unrestricted liberty to acquire wealth, lifts the right to property above the right to self-government, and protects the interests of established elites. This idea legitimizes the dominance of the wealthy, the aggressive, and the corporations in the name of individual freedom. The second is the vision of a realized democracy in which democratic self-government is superior to property and no group dominates any other. This idea extends the rights of political democracy into the social and economic spheres. The social gospel espoused the second vision. In the white churches, it was principally a response to industrialization and the corruption of the Gilded Age. The white social gospel put social justice on the agenda of the ecumenical churches. It changed how these churches talked about salvation. It created the ecumenical movement and the field of social ethics. It recovered the social justice emphasis of Hebrew scripture and the centrality of the kingdom of God in the teaching of Jesus. It was the greatest wave of social justice activism ever generated by the historic ecumenical churches, and it was a species of religious socialism. The social gospel that arose in Black churches was a struggle for a new abolitionism. It arose as a response to the abandonment of Reconstruction and an upsurge of racial terrorism. The Black social gospel enlisted the churches in the struggle for racial justice, helping to build protest organizations against racism and racial violence. It paved the way to the civil rights movement, the greatest story we have in this country, providing the social justice theology of the civil rights movement. Both of these social gospel traditions had democratic socialist flanks led by prominent figures. They were the wellsprings of every form of liberation theology, showing that struggles for economic justice and racial justice can fold together and must. W.D.P. Bliss, Vita Scudder, George Herron, Walter Rauschenbusch, and Walter Mueller were foremost among the white Christian socialists. Reverdy Ransom, George W. Woodby, Mordecai Johnson, Benjamin Mays, Pauli Murray, and Martin Luther King Jr. were foremost among the Black Christian socialists. I believe that political theology needs a better genealogy than the Carl Schmitt story it usually tells. It has an incomparably better one in the Black and white traditions of Christian socialism and more broadly religious socialism. It was not a coincidence that the social gospel, social ethics, sociology, the social sciences, socialism, and the ideas of social structure, social salvation, and social justice all arose at the same time. Also, corporate capitalism, the trade unions, and the first organizations devoted to racial justice. The social gospel developed the novel doctrine of social salvation, which was based on the emerging sociological idea of social structure, which gave rise to the idea of social justice. The key to the social gospel was its novel claim that the church has a mission to transform the structures of society in the direction of social justice. Neither part of that sentence was even a possibility before the 1880s. Before the modern era, nobody knew there was such a thing as social structure. In the social gospel, society became a subject of redemption. Social justice became intrinsic to salvation. The church began to say that salvation must be personal and social to be saving. A bad society makes ordinary people do bad things. A good society makes selfish people less selfish and violent. There was a key difference between European religious socialism and the American social gospel, and the difference was not socialism. Nearly the entire American movement supported producer cooperatives, economic democracy, and the socialization of natural monopolies, even as much of it steered clear of the S word. But the social gospel was an evangelical earthquake that should be called the Third Great Awakening. It proclaimed that America had fallen into miserable corruption and only a spiritual awakening would save America from its sins. The middle-class ministers who founded the white social gospel burned with shame at being criticized by the Knights of Labor, a radical Christian industrial union with no color bar. The Knights arose in the 1870s and had almost 1 million members by 1886. They were predominantly Protestant until Catholics poured into the union in the mid-1880s. The Knights blasted the churches for siding with the ruling class, but they got pulled into too many strikes and were violently suppressed by state militias. Then the Knights were surpassed by the American Federation of Labor, a federation of mostly conservative, racist, sexist craft unions that barred Black Americans, women, and entire categories of immigrants, especially Asians. The fall of the Knights deprived the social gospel of the kind of labor movement that existed nearly everywhere in Europe. Meanwhile, the founders of the Black social gospel were compelled to ask what a new abolitionism would be. Slavery, abolitionism, the Civil War, and Reconstruction had come and gone. Racial caste was codified. The 14th and 15th Amendments were obliterated in much of the country, and lynching became a national mania, a form of racial terrorism that backstopped the caste system. In this context, the Black social gospel founders said that churches had to enter the political struggle for justice. William Simmons, Reverdy Ransom, Ida B. Wells, Alexander Walters, Richard Wright Jr., Adam Clayton Powell Sr., and Nanny Burroughs were prominent among the founders. They urged that religious communities had to fuse progressive theology and social justice politics to combat white oppression. The next generation of Black social gospel leaders assumed the social gospel from the beginning of their careers. It wasn't something they had to come up with. They didn't have to give up what they had been. They grew up in it. Mordecai Johnson, Benjamin Mays, J. Pius Barber, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., Howard Thurman, Polly Murray. They paved the way to the King generation that founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Civil Rights Movement. When lightning struck in Montgomery, Alabama in December 1955, Martin Luther King Jr. was steeped in the Black social gospel. He had a freshly minted PhD from Boston University, and he imagined how his role models would respond to this moment. He preached that God is the personal ground of the infinite value of human personality. If the worth of personality is the infinite value in life, America's racial caste system was distinctly evil. Evil is precisely that which degrades personality, the sacred dignity of every human life. If Christianity meant anything in the USA, it had to shout against anti-Black racism and every kind of racism. The movement made King, not the other way around. But the movement that swept him to prominence would not have caught fire without him. Joanne Robinson, Rosa Parks, the Montgomery Women's Political Council, and E.D. Nixon were ready to challenge bus segregation when Parks provided a test case. Somebody had to speak for the boycott. Nixon excoriated the ministers when nobody volunteered. King walked in late to a meeting, and he took offense at being excoriated. History turned in a moment because it turned out that the newcomer was willing to risk his life. King had 20 minutes to plan what he would say that night. He had one guiding thought as he headed to Holt Street Church. Somehow, I have to be militant and moderate at the same time. He appealed to the democratic traditions of America the deep integrity of oppressed Black Americans and the teaching of Jesus. He made a justice run, declaring that there comes a time when people get tired of being trampled by the iron feet of oppression. The crowd roared with approval, and he made a second run. If this movement was wrong, so were the Supreme Court, the Constitution, Jesus, and God Almighty. If they were wrong, justice is a lie, and love has no meaning. They were reaching for the daybreak of freedom and justice. The crowd erupted at the stunning image of daybreak. King implored that love is one side of Christianity and justice is the other side. Religious people live in the spirit of love divine and employ the tools of divine justice. He ran out of metaphors for his third run, but the Holt Street Address perfectly distilled what became his message. Soon, it was King's trademark, helping him to personally link the fledgling theatrical church-based movement for racial justice in the South to the established institutional, mostly secular movement based in New York City. The northern-based movement had a lot of socialists. King relied on them. Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph, Stanley Levison, Norman Thomas, James Farmer. King took for granted that the social gospel at its best is democratic socialist, understood as social and economic democracy. He studied Rauschenbusch in seminary. He learned that his role models, Mays, Johnson, Barber, Thurman, and Farmer, were all Rauschenbusch socialists. And of course, his dean at Boston University, Mulder, was a Rauschenbusch socialist. For a while, SCLC floundered, even as King became famous. Martin Luther King was sensitive and peaceable. He talked about Gandhi, but it repulsed him to imagine that he would get people killed. It took the student sit-in explosion of 1960 to push King into actual Gandhian disruption. King decided that he needed to raise hell in the most hostile cities he could find, so he selected lieutenants who were willing to do it. SCLC became a fire alarm outfit relying on street theater and heroic agitation. It was long on charismatic male ministers who did not treat their female allies with the respect they deserved, and King was no exception. From 1960 to the end, King got more radical and angry every year. Alex Haley asked him in 1964 what his biggest mistake had been. King said, "It was overestimating the spiritual integrity of white ministers." Quote, "The projection of a social gospel, in my opinion, is the true witness of a Christian life," unquote. He said that most white ministers failed the test. Haley asked him if Black churches did any better, and King hedged on saying no. It was always difficult to mobilize Black ministers because they didn't like movements they didn't organize, and most of them had no experience with movement activism. Many of them just wanted to preach about heaven. But King stressed that Black churches dealt with daily threats to their existence that white people just could not imagine. There was no basis for comparison. King said, most white Americans are just abysmally ignorant about the true state of their society. And 3 variations of this ignorance were politically significant. One group was stridently bigoted and reactionary. A second group, public officials, did not fathom the harm that they caused because it just never occurred to them to actually listen to Black people. And the third group was the hardest to take, the enlightened types who admonished in patronizing fashion about proceeding gradually. Until 1966, King refused to say that white Americans never intended to integrate their schools and neighborhoods. Then he got pelted with rocks in Chicago, and he said it scathingly, telling SCLC, quote, "The white man literally sought to annihilate the Indian." King said, "This is what Black Americans are up against." By 1966, the backlash against the civil rights movement was ferocious. King refused to call it a backlash because it was usually blamed on him. Then he wrote his last book, Where Do We Go From Here? And he said, obviously there's a backlash, but what matters is what caused it. Racial hostility was always there. The civil rights movement merely brought it to the surface. Very near the end, in his last Christmas sermon, King made his usual vow to endure suffering, to respond to violence with soul force, and to love the oppressors. But now he said it by counterposing the dream and the nightmare, invoking the nightmares of the 4 church girls murdered in Birmingham and the miserable poverty of urban neighborhoods and American cities on fire and the war in Vietnam. At the end, King was unfathomably exhausted and depressed, living on the edge of despair. But he said he dared not give up hope because that is not an ethical option. Cornel West, delineating the principal intellectual and existential sources that shape Martin Luther King, rightly names 4 in order of importance: prophetic Black church Christianity, prophetic liberal Christianity, prophetic Gandhian nonviolence, and prophetic American civil religion. West says the King embodied the best of American Christendom by synthesizing these sources. But this project was not unique to King, for it defines precisely the Black social gospel that influenced King. He stood in a tradition of Black social gospel intellectuals who heard the prophetic gospel in the Black church, who appropriated social gospel criticism, who engaged the Gandhian revolution and called America to stop betraying its vaunted ideals of democracy, freedom, and equality. The weakest link in this chain was the one that white America lifted up after King was gone. King the dreamer who called America to its own creed. King himself played down this trope in his later life, as it did not comport very well with the surging tide of Black anger that he shared with the Black Power movement. It became even more problematic as soon as he was gone. The more that white liberals embraced King as a hero, the more ambiguous he became for Black Americans still denigrated by white society. It became hard to remember how radical King had been. He seemed to be wholly outstripped by Stokely Carmichael and Rap Brown. But Martin Luther King Jr. did not become the most hated person in America on a misunderstanding. He struck with audacity and forcefulness in the most hateful cities he could find. And at the end, he was more radical than anybody around him. He dragged SCLC to Chicago. He frightened and appalled the civil rights establishment by coming out against the Vietnam War. Then he committed to the Poor People's Campaign, and the entire executive staff was against him. Many of the young people who demonstrated this week came of age during the transition from Obama to Trump. Obama was careful, supremely gifted, and very soon frustrated. He was a good president who could have been better, but all of that became secondary to the pathos of his presidency. Obama sowed a ferocious, titanic backlash merely by living in the White House and doing his job. Every day that he served, Obama made this nation look better than it was, something that Trump keenly understood while putting it differently. There has never been a breakthrough for racial justice in this country that did not set off a bigger backlash than whatever it reacted against. Today's young people came of age when idealistic talk about a post-racial future gave way to anxious talk about losing our way. Then it became undeniable that we have lost our way. Many white religious communities are trying for the first time to have a conversation about their own racism. For decades, they pleaded, "We're so welcoming and we want to be diverse. Why are we so white?" Finally, they're getting past that stage. But the next stage is painful, and people recoil from it. White fragility is hair trigger and self-protective. Many of us were taught that racism is essentially a problem of racial bias, a prejudice to be overcome. 2 years ago, a Starbucks employee in Philadelphia called the police because 2 Black men were sitting in the store waiting for a friend to arrive. Starbucks closed its stores in embarrassment for 4 hours to conduct what it called a racial bias education day. Well, you have to start somewhere, and at least they did it. While customers pounded on the doors, demanding their frappuccinos. But fixing on racial bias is only a starting point. People do not admit to being racially biased, and the bias concept reinforces the race-blind idea of racial justice. Racism as bias yielded generations of white liberals who claimed that the most anti-racist thing they could do was just to ignore race altogether. Howard Thurman's spiritual mentor, Quaker theologian Rufus Jones, refused to say or write anything about racism, even as he wrote constantly about peace and the inner light. He reasoned that race is a baleful category, so just pay it no mind, ignore it away. My students cannot fathom how this kind of white liberal could have possibly been ethically sincere. The biased view produces sincere reductionists who just want to be blameless by their lights. White supremacy is a structure of power based on privilege that presumes to define what is normal. For 18 years, before I moved to New York, I taught at a liberal arts college that I loved dearly and which was very much like many others. We struggled to attract Black and Asian students and faculty. We did even worse at recruiting Latinx students and faculty, and we outright failed to retain African American faculty. Some of us took part in anti-racism workshops. We confessed our racism and we thought, okay, now we're getting somewhere. But nothing really changed, even if entire departments went to the workshops. One year we lost 80% of our African American faculty. Why was this happening? It was tempting to blame the colleagues who pined for the white male monoculture of the past, but the college made a strong commitment to multiculturalism. The opposition decreased through retirements, and we still lost Black colleagues. On their way out, they said, "This place is so white, I can't breathe here." Finally, our group of workshop veterans began to interrogate the culture of whiteness. This was harder and way more painful than the anti-bias approach, but it exposed the structures of privilege that insulated our existence. What is saving is for white people to relinquish the privileges of whiteness and for all people to love Blackness. White culture is transparent to white persons wherever they are dominant. It's hard to see because it's everything that's not specifically African American culture, Latinx culture, and so on. If you live in this society without being constantly reminded of your race, and you don't have to worry about representing your race, and you can worry about racism without being viewed as self-interested, and you don't have to worry about being targeted by police for your race, you are a beneficiary of it. The work of recent years in religious communities, in schools, in civic organizations, in ecumenical organizations like this one, and in the media, is beginning to pay off. Look at the crowds that have gathered in the past week to protest against anti-Black racism. We have never seen anywhere near this many white people willing to put themselves out there. And that's in the middle of a pandemic. It may be that Trump will benefit in November from the protests against racism. Nobody knows how that will play out. But there is such a thing as doing what is right. This is a moment to put everything on the line. We don't have to be the country that stands for bigotry and selfishness. The love ethic of faith makes you care, makes you angry, throws you into the struggle, keeps you in it, helps you face another day. Hang in there, friends. I am so deeply grateful for your ministry in Boston.
Gary, you've given us a feast of ideas to think about. I want to say thank you on behalf of everybody gathered here, because I know how deeply you are committed to this work. And we ourselves throw ourselves into commitment as well. And you help to light the way forward. Thank you.
Ronnie.
Let me turn the mic, if I can speak metaphorically of a mic, over to Shelton Oakley Hershey, and she's going to moderate the questions. Shelton?
Hi, Dr. Dorrien. I just want to reiterate my, or echo Rodney's thanks for the thoughtfulness and also the courage to speak truthfully to this group of people, because you've spoken truthfully to yourself and others. I'd love to start with two questions that were sent to us already by individuals. The first question is as follows. In the context of the recent homicides of Black people and impassioned protests and riots, how would you persuade white people who are not socially active to get involved?
Thank you. Firstly, Rodney kind of threw something out there when he didn't say anything about who I was. Then I thought, oh goodness, should I try to sneak some of that sort of in here? And then clearly I made a split-second decision, just say, oh well, whoever I am, let's just get into it. So that was reverberating through my head though all along. It's like so much of what I was doing there is sort of presuming some sense of, you know, who is this character who's just sort of going right into something.
You're amply described in the program book.
Yeah, what I would say about this is that for all of the work that I've been doing in churches for all these years, and in just this area, because I was a solidarity organizer all through my 20s, and was ordained, finally joined a church when I was 28, and became an Episcopal pastor at 30, and very belatedly became an academic at 35. So you would think with that sort of organizing background and profile, and having spent my whole life in this kind of work, that this would be just one of the easiest questions of all, right? That it's sort of a softball. And yet it's actually, it's one of the hardest ones. And I feel like I've spent most of my life just sort of failing at the question in the way that it's really intended. That is, what can you do to inspire people or evoke something in people who who really should be out there but aren't. And it's, I have certain things to say about people who are just sort of totally outside of contexts that I can get into. That's one kind of work that goes on in broader media and doing radio shows and the like. But in fact, I've spent most of my work has gone on in contexts where the work really was to try to get people who are already within earshot, but who don't really do anything yet, right? And here, so here, the part of the question that I do know something about, and really, and have sort of strong sort of beliefs about what is missing, is when people are able to be part of a religious community, wherever you are, and go for years and never have even heard that there's such a thing as broad-based interfaith community organizing, not be able to name what IAF is, or Gamaliel, or Faith at Work, which was formerly called PICO, or DART, or Interfaith Worker Justice, or all these organizations that just do fabulous work, which are there to be entered and to be instruments they're available for people to be involved. For me, the struggle has always been how to get to that vast number of folks that we've already got their attention in some way. They're showing up to religious services. They're reading the journals we write for and the like, and yet it only sort of doesn't go any further than just sort of that tuning in, but doesn't lead to something. That's the part of this question that catches me, and I am a very strong believer in interfaith broad-based community organizing. I think anytime I find myself in a place, which is too often, speaking out on the road, where I'll ask for a show of hands, and if people don't even know what it is, I know there's some opportunity here I just have to take right now, because there are resources available in our religious communities that the vast majority of the people who even have some relationship to our communities, not even to speak of those who are just outside, but those who are inside often don't even know. That work, trying to get people from a place of kind of passivity where they're already there but not really doing anything yet, to being mobilized to do something. And that is one reason why I will tell this social gospel story, because sometimes people, it's a surprise to people to even learn that, in my own denominational history, my church, my congregation, my synagogue has some history of being involved in these kind of struggles. They're just surprised that that's just not what religion is in their experience. But sort of telling this story, and then to say, yes, all those peace and justice organizations that exist in all the denominations today, they all came out of this very history I just recounted. And they're there, for your service. So that tends to be more the fulcrum of where I would go with this question, and then how to speak to others then who just aren't tuned in at all. That becomes a broader problem of what other audiences do we have? How else do we go about sort of reaching people? I enormously admire people like Cornel West and Michael Eric Dyson and many others who are friends of mine who are just sort of speaking to that broader public all the time, and who in fact devoted their own academic careers to speaking to as broad an audience as they can. It's just enormously important work, and I'm grateful there's some people who do it very well.
Thank you, Dr. Dorrien. Just wanted to note what a profound insight that was, to be able to understand where our friends and family and community members are on that continuum of action and understanding themselves before we understand how to inspire them. a personal question for you. What specifically keeps hope alive for you these days?
Thank you. This is another hard one, actually. Although maybe, I mean, I spoke to it in the talk. I went there, I said the kind of thing that, I said what King always said when he was asked about this. Because my identification with King here is pretty strong. I don't, I mean, there's just, my whole career, my whole life from college onward has been involved in this work, and I do find joy in it. And I've never been someone who felt that he had to sort of discipline himself to it, that I just have to somehow keep my nose to the grindstone, or I'm having to will myself to something that I wouldn't otherwise want to do. I find great joy and meaning in this kind of work, and can't really imagine not being in it. And that, all that being the case, I do have the Martin Luther King answer about this, that it's just, for me, it's just ethically, it's just not even an option. So it's never been a question of, will I or won't I? Now, there are ways of describing what that is that I think are problematic. And indeed, as many folks today who are especially influenced by Afro-pessimism would say, there are ways of talking about hope that just makes, it's just a kind of white assimilationist trope that sort of keeps a certain kind of white middle-class idealism alive and sort of and self-perpetuated. And that, of course, is not what I mean at all. That's why no matter where I am, I will give a talk that's as hard-edged as the one I gave today. I will, because I don't believe that white middle-class idealism is what we need. And so the kind of hope language that sustains it is not what I'm describing here. But I was a pastor for a number of years before I became an academic. And I suspect that every pastor, everyone who has been in a situation of leading a congregation in any kind of religious community knows something here about just the sheer necessity of being a bearer of hope. That you are always in some kind of pastoral relationship with people who are barely struggling just to get through. Just did they even get there that day? Can they get through a day? When you deal with people as intimately as pastors do, and you know what has driven them down, and how so many of them are struggling with depression and hopelessness and feeling disempowered and just feeling denigrated. That is in the job description, that you are with people in their suffering and helping them to see that they're it can be better than this, and being a bearer of hope is just, as I said, there's a certain ethical obligation there that I think is just intrinsic to the work. But the last thing I would say about this, I think in some ways, I'm not the best person to speak to this question the way it comes from a lot of folks. Many people, I can only be in it if I could sustain some kind of hope that I'm going to succeed, and I can't see any hope of that, therefore I am hopeless, right? I do think this is where it helps to be religious, because religious people are called to be faithful, not to be successful. And here, this is just a reflection on many years of being involved in organizing, but it is my experience, just take it for what it's worth, that a disproportionate number of the folks within long-term peace and justice organizing who just hang in there through the decades are people who've got some kind of religious wellspring in their lives that ties them to some kind of ethic of faithfulness, that they really aren't judging, at least totally judging, the worthiness of their action by the worldly efficacy of what they've achieved of late. I do think that's, I've in a lot of talks out on the road, I will have a moment about 90% through if I'm talking before a secular crowd, totally secular crowd, and I'll just say, just for what it's worth, folks, I do think it helps to be religious.